He laughed, and all the little gears answered. I was bent over an opened carriage clock when the sound arrived, soft, bright, a spill of light in a room that usually measured time in whispers. The morning in Old Town Prague was still shy. Frost clung to the workshop window like crystal dust, and the astronomical clock across the square had not yet cleared its throat for the first procession. I held my breath, a screwdriver between my fingers, and the balance spring made a shy tremor, as if startled into listening. "Is it a bad time?" he asked from the doorway. "Time," as if there were any other whether we spoke. "It's a clock shop," I said, not looking up. "Every time is important." Then I promised to be brief. He stepped inside, bringing November's iron smell and a rustle of film canisters bumping against one another. "I'm looking for someone who knows how to keep a stubborn second hand from stuttering." "Those are the most honest seconds," I said. "They tell you where the heart hesitates." He set an old military wristwatch on the felt pad. The crystal was scuffed, the crown wobbly, and the dial had a faint thumbprint of dust that would never wholly leave. I lifted it with tweezers. The watch had not been made to be beautiful. It had been made to survive. "It belonged to your grandfather," I guessed. He shook his head. "Not yet." I looked up then. His eyes were the color of smoky tea, and the camera at his chest looked heavier than it needed to be. He had the posture of someone born carrying something, and surprised to find his hands empty. "War photographer," I said, because the camera wore its job like a scar. He smiled. There it was, the laughter that convinced my gears to harmonize. "Journalist, they say." Photographs happen to be how I listen. "I'm Elias." "Theresa," I said, and tested the crown. The spring slurs at the half-minute. It's either tired or sentimental. I've never met a sentimental spring. "Give me until the noon chiming," I said. "You can come back when the saints are done marching." He glanced toward the window where the astrolabe's rings glowed like patient constellations. "And while I wait, you could visit my garden," I said. "It's ridiculous enough to cure any waiting." He raised an eyebrow. "A clock shop with a garden." "Behind the workshop," I said, gesturing toward the rear door. "It's small and entirely unnecessary, which is why I keep it." He came at noon, as promised, and the saints paraded. Bones of sunlight rattled across the square. I placed the watch on his palm. It had learned obedience. The second hand leaped the half-minute cleanly, as if it had decided to trust its own movement. "What do I owe you?" he asked. "Show me something true," I said, surprising myself. "One photograph you never show anyone." He hesitated. The reluctance was not vanity but reverence. Then he untied the small canvas pouch at his belt, and slipped out a strip of negatives. He held them up so the square's light poured through. In the amber panes, a woman turned her face toward a window. Hair braided and unafraid, her hands held up not in surrender but in greeting. In another frame, a row of cups sat in the blasted kitchen, unbroken, as if the morning intended to resume itself. "I took this after a ceasefire," he said. "I was supposed to look for damage. I found continuity." He smiled without showing teeth. "Her name was Anna. A nurse. She kept a kettle boiling for anyone who came through. A name is a small piece of gravity." It tugged, not cruelly, simply, the way a river pulls a reed to one side, so it can hear itself better. I folded the negatives back into his pouch and tied the string as if it were a promise that would not belong to me. "This way," I said, and pushed open the rear door. The garden was a sort of watch I could walk into. On the left, a thin trellis held climbing roses, each bloom tagged with a brass disc that recorded the moment it first opened, day, hour, minute. A chain of tiny brass bells clinked whenever the wind made a decision. In the center stood the garden clock, my favorite nonsense, a weatherproof casing with an escapement large enough to see, its pendulum a wrought iron leaf swinging over time and chamomile. A subtle shaft connected it to the irrigation valves, so that each hour, a different bed received a sip of water, and every morning at 9 the lilies were surprised into waking. "It listens to the sky," I said. "A barometric sensor delays the watering if rain approaches, but otherwise it keeps its own counsel." Elias walked the gravel path as if he were letting it protect his boots. His fingers skimmed the brass tags. His camera stayed quiet. And this? He asked, stopping at a wooden frame the size of a window. Inside it, dozens of tiny gears turned and stopped, irregular and alive. Breathing frame, I said. Each gear corresponds to a friend. When I think of one, I wind that gear a little. It'll unwind on its own throughout the day. It keeps me honest about attention. I pointed to 3 that moved with immodest energy. My 2 sisters and my father. This one, I tapped a quiet gear. A pen pal from a town that lost its post office. I write anyway. Does anyone wind you back? He asked. I have tea, I said lightly. Bergamot wins everything. He laughed again. The gears agreed. The November sun sank its teeth in gingerly, finding no purchase on the frost. We sat on the wooden bench I'd varnished until the green looked like ripples frozen mid. Do you ever leave? He asked. Prague likes to convince the people who fix it to stay, I said. But yes. I follow the Danube once a year, till it remembers the Black Sea. I think of it as sending the city a letter and waiting for the reply. I never stay, he said, not apologizing. I file a story, move on before it learns my name. Gears. Name. The garden was quietly obedient. The bells were bored. I wanted the day to consent to one small rebellion. What if, I said, you let this place write your name down for once? I don't want to owe a city, he said. I already owe too many people. Owing and belonging are different machines, I said. One counts, the other keeps. He considered that. His fingers, those careful, shut-a-bittable, hands rested on the bench. I could try owing you a pastry, he said. Is there a bakery that opens for pessimists? The one by the bridge opens for everyone. We crossed the square like a pair of magnets, observing each other's polite field. He moved with the alertness of someone who expected an explosion where most people expected a pigeon. We ate poppy seed cola-y, that powdered regret into silence. He told me about border checkpoints that treated cameras like contraband and hotel rooms, where the beds seemed borrowed from hospital wards. I told him about a widow who brought in her husband's pocket watch every year on their wedding anniversary because its ticking kept her from inventing a second heartache. When we returned to the workshop, the afternoon hour struck, and the little trapdoor figures across the square performed their ancient resignation. I cleaned the watch's case, polished the crystal, and set the time by the garden clock, which was set by the city clock, which was set by a radio time signal from a country I had never seen. The chain of trust was absurd and faithful. You can keep it, he said abruptly, nodding at the watch. Until I come back. You think you will? I tried to make it a simple question. If the editor lets me, he said. If the train is not delayed. If the border opens on time. If I finish a story that isn't a wound. He looked at the breathing frame on the wall. Wind one for me. Only if you leave me a name to engrave, Elias. Then, he said, spelling it as if the letters were stones across a stream. And the watch consider it a deposit. He left at dusk, a gentleman paying a bill in a currency that would later become insufficient. The garden gathered its shadows. I listened to the new gear breathe in short, uncertain bursts. I set the watch on the workbench and wound it once. The second hand did not stutter. It obeyed midnight and mercy with equal discipline. After closing, I carried a lantern out to the garden, just to prove to myself it would be there in the dark. The brass discs on the roses kept their tiny secrets. The bells pretended not to be cold. I rested the lantern on the stone lip of the pond where a skim of ice rehearsed the idea of winter and told the water, not the sky, that I might be foolish enough to wait for someone who belonged to departures. The next morning, his laugh was still in the room. Not an echoes follow. This felt like a residue, a warmth left where a hand had been. I placed the watch by the window and set the breathing frame to a dignified tempo. And as the square filled with tourists and mercies and the saints marched again, I thought of a woman at a kettle in a kitchen that had survived everything but the angle of light. I wondered what it meant to be the kind of person someone mentions when putting away their truths. By evening, the breathing frame had learned his name. I wound it again before I locked up, and the garden answered, simple as winter, present, patient, exact. I did not yet know that a gear can become a season. That a season can become a clock. That a clock can stop at a sentence you don't hear yourself say until it is the only thing left moving. But that comes later. For now, morning was honest. The watch kept time. The garden slept and woke on cue. And Theresa, clockmaker of the small and the stubborn, set another brass disc aside. Flat and waiting, for the day a rose would open to the sound of someone coming home. The winter crept in quietly, like a rumor that wanted to be believed. Frost webbed the window panes, and the astronomical clock outside now chimed through breath clouds instead of birdsong. Elias's watch still sat by the window. I wound it every morning, the way people feed stray cats, out of superstition, out of hope, out of some need to stay kind to something that might not return. The watch was punctual. My thoughts were not. I told myself it was simply maintenance, that a craftsman cannot abandon an unfinished repair. But sometimes, when the ticking fell into rhythm with the garden clock outside, I could swear the two conspired, whispering perhaps, about departures that forgot to end. December gifted the square its slow light. Tourists vanished, replaced by locals with their collars high and tempers low. Business was thin. Only the faithful came for repairs, people who believed time could be mended if they paid enough attention. One morning as I cleaned the breathing frame, the smallest gear, the one with his name, stopped entirely. I froze, brush midair. It had run perfectly for weeks, unwound at a steady pace. Now it was still. I tapped it gently. Nothing. I whispered, "Don't you dare," as if scolding a heartbeat. The frame stayed quiet. That day, I wrote him a letter I didn't intend to send. Elias, I imagine the border smells like oil and snow. I imagine your hands are still steady when you aim the camera, but tremble when you put it down. The garden remembers you. The lilies waited too long and bloomed all at once, like a confession they couldn't hold. If I could, I'd send you a small gear from the breathing frame. You'd laugh and say, "Theresa, you can't mail mechanics." But I could, you know. I could mail proof that something here still turns because of you. Keep the watch wound. Even dreams need precision. I sealed the letter, left it on the counter, and every morning for 3 weeks I didn't mail it. Sometimes that's what waiting is. The art of not choosing. Then, in early January, he returned, not in person, but in print. A newspaper at the corner cafe carried his byline. Front page, "Peace talks in ashes inside the border hospital." The photo was unmistakably his. A field tent under hard light. In the background, blurred but luminous, a woman, her posture almost prayerful, her hands bandaging a stranger's arm. "Anna?" I folded the paper until the ink smudged. The garden clock outside skipped a beat, or maybe I did. That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered into the workshop at 2 a.m., and wound all the clocks, every last one, until the air pulsed with tiny heartbeats. The breathing frame ticked unevenly, like lungs after running. The gear with his name twitched once, twice, then began to move again, slower than before. "Good," I whispered. "Good boy." Outside, snow fell the way silence teaches language, soft, complete, and merciless. He came back at the end of February. I heard his laugh before I saw him, an echo rehearsed by memory. He stood in the doorway, wearing a coat heavy with distance. His camera was gone. His hands were bare. "You fixed my seconds too well," he said. "They refused to pass." "You're late," I said. "I wanted to see if you'd notice." I noticed everything. He smiled, but his eyes were elsewhere, tracking something invisible. "They rebuilt the field hospital. Anna stayed behind. She teaches the children now. She writes letters, though not to me." I didn't ask if he wished she did. The answer lived in the small tremor of his voice. He placed a photograph on the counter, black and white, under a child holding a cracked pocket watch, smiling at something outside the frame. "She found this watch in the rubble," he said. "It doesn't work, but she refuses to throw it away. Says it's proof that even broken things can still mark time." I looked down. The irony didn't need explaining. "She sounds kind," I said. "She is." The air between us tightened like the spring inside a clock before it breaks or begins. I turned to the window. "Your watch has been dreaming without you." He laughed softly. "And what does it dream of? Of the sea, maybe? Of someone returning? He took the watch, wound it, listened. It kept perfect time, he murmured. Better than I did. The saints began their parade again. Brass angels, wooden apostles, a clock that never tired of forgiveness. He looked around the workshop as though cataloging the unchanged. You kept it all running. Someone has to, I said. The city depends on liars like us people who pretend time can be repaired. He nodded, and for a moment he looked older, not by years, by weight. By what he had carried back that couldn't be shown on film. I brought something, he said, reaching into his coat. A roll of negatives, uncut. You might like this one. He held it to the window. The winter light slid through the film, sketching shapes across my work table. One frame showed the field, another the sky, and in the third, a figure walking away from the camera, coat unbuttoned, holding something small that might have been a watch. Is that you? I asked. He shook his head. No, that's the one I couldn't follow. The silence afterward was exact, the kind only a clockmaker could measure. He left the negatives on my table, said he'd return when the garden bloomed again. But as the door closed, I knew, seasons don't repeat, they rhyme. When I wound his watch that night, it ticked faintly, like remembering. And outside, the garden clock hesitated half a beat late as if time itself bowed for morning. Some clocks don't tick. They breathe. In March, Prague thawed like a secret being confessed too early. Water dripped from the eaves into the garden's tiny pond, breaking the last skin of ice with a sound like glass forgiving itself. Elias came by most mornings now, always with a notebook, rarely with words. He said he was between stories, but the quiet that followed said otherwise. He would sit near the window while I worked, his gaze following the pendulum's patient swing, as though trying to borrow its rhythm. I had learned the difference between silence and stillness. Silence was when nothing was said. Stillness was when everything waited to be. Sometimes, he watched the garden clock, as if hoping the hours would spell her name again. I didn't have to ask who her was. The shadow of Anna lingered in the way he looked at light, tender, guilty, unwilling to blink. One morning he placed a small envelope on my work table. For you, he said. Inside was a photograph, the hospital courtyard, rebuilt, its stones newly scrubbed. In the center stood Anna, arms crossed, a child on her hip, sunlight clinging to the edge of her scarf. The picture wasn't romantic, it was reverent. She sent it to me, he said quietly. As thanks. Said she's happy I'm alive. And you? I asked. I don't know what I am, he said. Alive feels different when you leave someone behind to prove it. He turned the photo over. On the back, Anna's handwriting looped across the paper. Keep the world honest. He laughed once, brittle. She always believed in repair, like you do. I said nothing. My hands were steady only because my heart refused to be. After he left, I set the photo against the breathing frame. The gear with his name slowed, then turned a little faster, as if jealous. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went to the garden and listened to the water clocks whisper under moonlight. The air smelled of iron and thaw. For a moment, I imagined I could win the whole city its regrets, its lovers, its unfinished symphonies, until everything ticked again. But even the most faithful clocks can't mend the silence between seconds. By late spring, Elias and I were almost domestic in our routine. He brought pastries. I brewed tea. We argued about which saint had the worst posture on the astronomical clock. And sometimes, in the middle of laughter, his smile would falter, a small fracture where nostalgia leaked through. One day, a letter arrived. No sender's name, only foreign stamps. I recognized the handwriting immediately, Anna's. He stood beside me when I handed it to him. It's yours, I said. Open it, he replied. I can't. The paper smelled faintly of disinfectant and rain. I unfolded it. Elias. I'm writing because I saw your photographs in the paper again. You caught what I miss, the way people reach out even when they're too tired to believe in rescue. I hope the city you live in forgives you for surviving. I have no watch now, but every morning I count until the kettle boils and pretend it's time enough for both of us. Be kind to the woman who fixes things. She understands what I tried to teach you. I folded the letter slowly, afraid it would bleed. Elias looked at me, his eyes unreadable. She's good at goodbyes, he whispered. She doesn't sound like she's saying goodbye, I said. She never does. That's how she leaves. He reached for the letter, then stopped midway. Keep it, he said. You read it better than I could. He left before I could answer. The bell above the door trembled, unsure if it should mourn or announce. I placed the letter in the drawer beside his watch. That night, I wound neither. Outside, the garden clock hesitated again, as if even time needed to choose between moving forward and standing still. The city forgot winter before I did. By April, sunlight spilled through the square like liquid brass, and tourists returned with cameras raised, chasing hours that didn't belong to them. Inside the workshop, I worked slower. Not out of laziness, but out of caution, as if rushing would make time notice me. Elias hadn't come in days. The last thing he left behind was the letter from Anna and the smell of unspoken choices. I tried to pretend that absence was a kind of silence I could measure, but silence doesn't measure. It expands. The breathing frame ticked unevenly again. His gear, that small brass circle with the name I had engraved by hand, now swung out of rhythm. It would stop, twitch, then lurch forward, stubborn as hope. I leaned closer and whispered, "You too, huh?" It didn't answer. Clocks rarely do. That evening, I visited the Charles Bridge. The vault of a river carried reflections like moving secrets. Couples strolled, artists sketched, and somewhere a violinist played a melody I almost recognized because it carried his laugh and someone else's name. I thought of Elias and Anna, of the letter, the photograph, the child with the cracked pocket watch. And I realized I had become an archivist of seconds, collecting the tiny invisible moments he left behind. The scent of his teacup, the dent in the bench where he sat, the unfinished story he never told. I didn't love him for his presence anymore. I loved him for his timing, the way he arrived exactly when I stopped believing someone would. But timing, I'd learned, is the cruelest craftsman of all. A week later, he returned. No warning, no letter. Just the soft thud of boots on cobblestone and his voice saying my name like a rehearsal. Theresa, I turned. He looked tired in the kind of way words can't fix. The space under his eyes had gone gray, and there was a letter folded in his hand. She's leaving, he said. Anna. They offered her a position overseas, field hospitals, new programs, everything she ever wanted. And you? I asked. I don't know, he said. She asked me to come with her. Said it would feel like purpose again. The word purpose hurt more than love ever did. I set down the clock spring in my hand. And what did you tell her? I told her I'd think about it. So that's why you came back. To think near me, he flinched. Don't do that. Do what? Make it sound like I'm using you. I smiled faintly. If you were, at least it means I matter. The sentence hung between us, fragile and true. He exhaled slowly. You matter, Theresa. You're the reason I still stay. Stay doesn't mean choose, I said. You can stay in many places without belonging to any. He looked at me then, the way people look at a clock that's always been there, suddenly aware of how much it's given, and how little they've listened. I'm sorry, he whispered. Don't be, I said. You're just keeping your time. After he left, I found myself winding every clock in the shop, every single one. The air filled with ticking, 1,000 tiny hearts competing to be heard. The breathing frame spun unevenly, faster, then slower. I wound his gear harder than I should have. It squeaked a tiny cry of protest, and then stopped. I touched it once, gently. That's enough, I said. You've waited long enough. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase. Not for him, not for Anna, not even for Prague, for myself. I wrote him a note and left it by the window beside his watch. Elias, if time ever lets you go, you'll find me where it stands still, somewhere clocks no longer matter. You once said you wanted to tell a story that wasn't a wound. So tell this one right. The clockmaker didn't break. She simply stopped counting. Then I locked the shop, handed the key to the landlord, and walked toward the train station. Behind me, the astronomical clock struck noon. The saints circled, the trumpets sang. and for the first time, I didn't look back. The shop smelled of dust and lavender when I came back. Her absence was louder than any ticking clock. The note lay where she had left it, folded once. The handwriting still precise like her repairs, like the way she always kept sorrow neatly wound. If time ever lets you go. I stopped reading after that line. The rest could wait, though I already knew it would be too late to answer. I sat by the window, watching the light move across the brass gears she'd polished every morning. Outside, the saints began their noon parade again, wooden smiles. Patient forgiveness, a ritual built to remind people that time doesn't care who's missing. For the first time in years, I didn't lift my camera. I simply watched, the way she used to, as if the world could be understood by how it moved, not how it was captured. 3 days later, the landlord gave me her key. She said you'd come, he told me. She didn't say when. Inside, everything was untouched, the unfinished clocks, the teapot by the stove, the breathing frame on the wall. I walked to it instinctively. Her name wasn't there, of course, but mine was. My gear had stopped again. I tried to wind it, clumsy, unfamiliar. The mechanism resisted, then clicked once like a heartbeat revived just to remember dying. In the drawer, I found the letter she'd never mailed to me. The one she'd written back when the gear stopped the first time. It was still sealed, but I opened it anyway, the way I used to open borders with a mix of guilt and need. Elias, I imagine the border smells like oil and snow. Her words blurred halfway through. I read them aloud until my throat turned into gravel. All this time, I had believed my photographs preserved people. But she had preserved time itself. I stayed in Prague, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because leaving would mean accepting that she no longer belonged to my coordinates. I reopened the shop, kept the clocks running, learned to wind them the way she did. Slow, kind, precise. Tourists came and went. I sold repairs, brewed tea, sometimes even smiled. But every night, when the city fell quiet, I wound the watch she left me, the same one I'd given her as a deposit hand. I talked to her as if she were just late returning from the market. Theresa, I'd whisper, today the lilies bloomed an hour early. Your garden clock must be proud. I never heard an answer. But sometimes, a bell would tremble somewhere, and I'd let myself believe it was her. One morning, months later, a letter arrived. The envelope bore no name, only a return mark from a seaside town. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper thick. To Elias, I'm writing for someone who prefers quiet places. She asked me to send this because she no longer writes on paper. Her hands tremble when she tries. She lives near the coast now, repairs tide clocks for the harbor, and sometimes people leave flowers at her door, because the air there smells of brass and bergamot. She wanted you to know that her seconds are full, and her silence is gentle. She says she's grateful you once taught her what waiting sounds like. No reply needed. A friend. There was no signature, no return address. Just the faint scent of salt. I placed the letter inside the breathing frame, beside my gear. Then I wound it once, very carefully. It turned slowly, faithfully, beautifully. That evening, I walked to the Charles Bridge. The violinist was there again, playing under a sky so blue, it almost forgave. I took one photograph, not for a story, not for the paper, not for herb, but for time itself. When I developed it later, the image surprised me. The bridge was empty, the light soft, and yet, between the stones and the air, there was a figure, blurred, faint, almost a reflection, standing where she once stood, lantern in hand. Maybe it was only the exposure, or maybe the city had decided that even ghosts deserved to arrive on time. Evening settles differently by the sea. In Prague, dusk used to arrive like a bell-measured ceremonial, full of echo. Here it slips in like a tide, silent and certain, washing the light away without apology. The harbor clock outside my window runs 5 minutes slow, but I don't correct it. I like those stolen minutes. They let me believe the world is still catching up. I live in a small house of salt and brass. The walls hum when the wind shifts, and gulls scratch their messages across the roof. I mend tide clocks for fishermen now, machines that follow the moon instead of the hour. They are stubborn, but honest. When the sea changes its mind, they obey. Sometimes, People leave flowers by my door. I never know who. Daisies, hydrangeas, once even a single red tulip. I keep them until they wilt, then dry the petals and tuck them inside an old watch box. I tell myself they are gears too, keeping time and color instead of sound. I don't write letters anymore. My hands shake too much. But I still talk to time. Every evening I sit by the window and whisper to the hour I used to fear most, the one where he would leave, the one where silence stayed. Did you find peace, Elias? I ask the horizon. The waves never answer directly. They only return smaller, softer, like they've learned to be kind. Once, a boy from the docks brought me a photograph he found in an antique stall. A bridge in Prague. The light was fading, the sky a tender bruise. Between the stones, a blur almost human, almost waiting. Is it you? He asked. I told him it was someone I used to be. Some nights, when the wind bends just right, I hear ticking from the sea itself. Not a machine's rhythm, something deeper. It reminds me of the breathing frame, of the garden that once obeyed rain instead of moonlight. I wonder if Elias still winds the clocks, if he ever found that story without a wound. If he didn't, it's all right. Time was never meant to heal, only to hold. At dusk, I light the small lantern I brought from Prague. Its glass is cracked, but it still glows. I hang it by the window, facing west. Somewhere, in another city, a man might glance up and mistake it for a signal, and maybe, for a moment, believe he has arrived on time. Theresa, the sea has its own clock. It pulls and returns, never early, never late. When the tide reaches my doorstep, I set my tools aside and listen. The rhythm is steady, 2 breaths in, 1 out, the same pattern Elias used when focusing his camera. Some days, I almost hear him. The faint click of a shutter, the low hum of thought before a photograph becomes memory. I wonder if he still walks across the bridge at dusk, or if he, too, has learned to measure time by silence. The locals say I talk to ghosts. I tell them they're wrong. Ghosts linger because they can't let go. But what I have isn't haunting, its correspondence. He sends me the sound of rain on cobblestone. I reply with the sound of waves against iron. No address, no stamp, only timing. Elias, the garden has forgotten my hands. The gears rust faster now. The roses bloom out of season. But the breathing frame still works, and every time I wind it, her name hums faintly through the brass like wind through reeds. I've stopped photographing people. Instead, I capture movement, pendulums, leaves, light shifting on old glass. A critic once said, my new work feels religious. He's wrong. It's mechanical devotion, faith rebuilt from patience and repetition. Sometimes, I walk to the river and imagine the tide touching the same hour she sees. When the bells of St. Nicholas ring, I whisper her name once quietly, so time won't notice. Theresa. At night, I repair a tide clock that refuses to follow the moon. Its needle points inland, stubbornly. I open its casing and find something caught inside. A small scrap of photo paper, damp but legible. A bridge. A blur. A man holding a lantern instead of a camera. I press it to my heart and laugh softly. Late as always. Then I fix the needle. It swings toward the sea again, obedient. Elias, spring in Prague begins with thunder. I was closing the shop when a gust of wind knocked something from the wall. Her old lantern, the one she left behind. It shattered, spilling its light like memory made liquid. I picked up the fragments, set them by the window. The storm rolled past, and for a heartbeat, I swore I saw a glimmer on the farthest horizon. A single light blinking once, steady, as if answering. I knew it wasn't possible. But clocks don't run on possibility. They run on belief. Theresa, tonight the tide is higher than usual. The lantern sways, its cracked glass scattering light into pieces that look like seconds breaking open. The air tastes of thunder and salt. I whisper into the wind, we're on the same hour again, Elias. The sea answers not with words, but with rhythm. 2 breaths in, 1 out. Exactly his. Theresa, that night the tide refused to rest. The waves reached higher than they should, licking the porch steps like something trying to remember. All the clocks in the house began to slow at once. When I lifted the lid of the tide clock, The second hand trembled, stopped, then began to move backward, as if it were searching for what it had lost. I did not panic. I only whispered, "All right then." Once more, I carried the lantern outside and stood at the edge of the water. The wind was thick with rain, the color of pewter. Each flash of lightning turned the harbor into a photograph, frozen, brilliant, unbearably honest. For a heartbeat I saw the bridge. Not this shore, not this country, the bridge in Prague, its stones slick with spring rain. Someone stood there holding a camera, looking straight through the storm. I could not see his face, but I knew the stance, the breath between each frame. The tide pulled, the lantern shook, and I whispered into the wind, "Elias, if you can hear me, stop counting, Elias." At the same hour, the city clocks went mad. The astronomical clock struck twice for the same minute. My watches on the wall shivered as if afraid. The air in the shop tasted of ozone and memory. When I reached for the breathing frame, every gear spun free. Time had forgotten its hands. Outside, thunder broke above the river. And then, in a single white flash, I saw her. Not a ghost. Not a vision. Just a woman standing somewhere far away, holding a light against a tide I could not name. "Theresa," I breathed. The sound folded into the storm, but the second hands everywhere, on every clock, every pocket watch stopped together. The city paused. The river inhaled. For one impossible instant, everything was still. "Theresa." The tide hesitated. The lantern's flame stretched upward, unbroken. For the first time since I left Prague, I felt the world waiting for what I didn't know. And then, quietly, every sound returned. Rain. Wind. A single clock tick from somewhere across the sea. I laughed through tears. "You found it," I said. The story without a wound. Elias, when the hands began to move again, they did so gently, like forgiveness, learning its rhythm. I picked up the shattered lantern glass from the windowsill and set the pieces into a circle. Inside it, I placed her old watch. It ticked once, then again, and the second hand moved forward slow, certain, whole. "Theresa." The storm passed before dawn. When I woke, the tide clock on my wall read exactly noon. Noon in Prague. I smiled. On time, at last. Elias' morning light filled the workshop. The clocks hummed in perfect unison for the first time since she'd gone. I wrote one line in my notebook, the only line the story needed. When time forgets its hands, it remembers its heart. And I let the day begin. Morning arrives here, the way forgiveness does. Quietly, after you've stopped expecting it. The tide left gifts on the shore last night. A brass cog, a fragment of sea glass, and a camera lens clouded with salt. I washed them, set them on the windowsill, and the sunlight passing through turned the whole room golden and slow. For a moment I thought I heard a shutter click, not in the air, but inside the light itself. I smiled. "You still take photographs, don't you?" The clocks in the house all agreed on one thing. For once they ticked in rhythm with the sea. The sound was softer than before, less urgent, like time had stopped chasing and learned to listen. I walk to the harbor every morning now. Children wave as they run past, their laughter spinning through the gulls' cries. The world is loud again, alive. On the bench near the pier sits an old watch I repaired weeks ago. Its owner never returned to claim it. I wind it daily anyway. Perhaps some stories aren't meant to be finished, only kept moving. Today, when I wound it, the second hand hesitated at the 12, then moved forward. That small, faithful step made the whole world seem possible again. I've started teaching a few of the fishermen's children how to fix the tide clocks. They call me the lady who mends the sea. It makes me laugh. Maybe they're right. Maybe every person who's ever loved deeply ends up fixing oceans in their own way. At night, I sit outside with the lantern. The glass is cracked beyond repair, but it still catches the wind, scattering little stars across the porch. Sometimes, if I close my eyes, I can almost hear his city breathing. The distant bells, the clatter of trams, the low murmur of tourists on cobblestones. And somewhere among those sounds, a single click of a camera. One, just one. Enough. I whisper into the dark, "Thank you for being on time, even once." The light flickers in reply. Perhaps that's how time answers, not with words, but with brightness that returns after you've learned to wait. Theresa, the harbor clock strikes 12 for the last time this year. Its sound drifts through the open window, mingling with the slow hush of waves. I set my tools down. The small watches I have repaired lie in a neat circle on the table, each one ticking at its own pace, yet somehow agreeing on peace. The tide will come soon, brushing against the porch steps like an old friend checking in. I pour tea for two out of habit. Mine stays warm, the other cup gathers light. When I close my eyes, I can feel him there, not as memory, but as motion, a steady rhythm beneath everything, like the heartbeat that keeps the world from falling apart. Time is breathing again. Elias, in Prague, the saints begin their noon parade. The crowd watches, I listen. Each mechanical figure moves with patient precision, the way she used to wind her clocks. The watch I keep in my pocket hers now, then mine again ticks faintly, its sound blending with the bells. I touch it and whisper, still here. The garden outside the shop is smaller these days, but this spring the roses opened exactly on the hour she used to call perfect. I left them untrimmed. They have earned their freedom. When the parade ends, I close the shutters, pour a cup of tea, and lift the camera one last time. Through the lens, light bends differently now, less to capture, more to understand. Theresa, evening. The lantern on my windowsill flickers low. I wind the tide clock, though it no longer needs it. The moon has learned to keep time on its own. For the first time, I let the second hand stop. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it's completion. Elias night settles over the river. The clocks in the shop slow, one by one, as if bowing. I don't correct them. Some endings deserve to keep their rhythm. I write the final line in the notebook beside her letters. She did not stop time. She taught it how to stay. Theresa, when the tide reaches the steps, it brings a thin ribbon of seaweed and a single rose petal. Impossible, but true. I laugh softly. You remembered? The sky begins to lighten, though dawn is still far away. I lift the lantern and let it rest on the water. It drifts outward, small and certain, carrying the last of the hour with it. Somewhere I know a man in another city will see a glimmer on the river, and smile without understanding why. Elias. Just before midnight, a light crosses the surface of the vault. It floats past the bridge, steady and golden. I lowered the camera. I don't need a picture. I whisper, on time, as always. And the light drifts on, becoming part of the current, part of the night, part of everything that still moves.